Historians think Nok artisans made the heads, the largest part of the body, thinking that it was the center of the body's life force. These figures may have been used to symbolize dead ancestors, fertility, or as charms against evil spirits. This head shows a distinctive hairdo arranged in 6 buns, and that is a style that's still worn by some people today in Nigeria. This similarity suggests that the Nok may have been the direct ancestors of some modern Africans. Not far from Nok in southern Nigeria is the holy city of Ife. Bronze and iron sculptured heads were found here from the 13th century. Like the Nok, Ife artists made the head larger because they believed it was the seat of the life force. Ife heads were typically 1/3 to 1/4 the size of the body. This head clearly portrays a powerful person. The elaborate headdress probably represents a crown, and there are traces of red and black paint on this sculpture. These sculptures created a sensation in the Western world when they were found in the late 1930s. At first, it was assumed that artwork like this could not have possibly been made by African artists. The detail and precision of human features caused some authorities to believe that they were human master or European masterpieces. And as you look at these faces, they really seem almost alive. The lines are similar to marks still found on Nigerians today. These skin patterns are called scarifications. Such scars often showed the rank of a person and tribal affiliation. Fortunately, today we know the sculptures from Ife are viewed as one of the highest achievements of African art and culture. Many of the Ife heads were made of bronze. The method used to make them was called the lost wax process. It was a difficult and complicated method that only highly skilled artists could use. It consists of modeling the piece of wax, covering it with clay, and then baking it. After the wax has melted and run out, being lost through the holes at the bottom of the clay, the holes are then stopped up and liquid bronze is poured in. This method is still in use today. Ife sculptures may have influenced artists in Benin who produced equally impressive works in bronze during the same period. The Kingdom of Benin was located at southwest of Ife near the Niger River Delta. It's located in what is now southern Nigeria. Today, there is the modern country of Benin, but it is much smaller than the kingdom that I've been talking about historically. Benin was a monarchy with the first kings ruling in the 1200s. In the 1400s, a king named Iwari made Benin into a major African state. He built a powerful army which eventually controlled an area that stretched from the Niger River Delta in the east into what is today Lagos, Nigeria. The king of Benin was called an Oba. Artists working for the Oba, or king, created magnificent brass heads of the royal family, like this one that you see from the 16th century. And most of the art that we have are statues of royalty and decorations for the king's palace. All Benin kings had to create a shrine honoring the king's predecessor, his father, his ancestor, and the former leader of the kingdom. So you're looking at the head of the king's father, and this head would have been placed on a holy altar. The ruling king was also expected to visit this altar to communicate with his father to gain advice. This ritual would reinforce the idea of rule by a dynasty, a single family ruling from generation to generation. And the headdress on this statue represents a deceased king, and it was cast by the lost wax method. This is the head of the king's mother. The mother of the king was also important historically, and that's why she's represented artistically. Idea, that was her name. It was the mother of the king, and she was a shrewd politician. She was a strategist. She had mystical powers and medicinal knowledge, and these skills all helped her son to keep the throne in the late 1400s. So, to reward and honor her, the king created the title of respect called King Mother, and he had this brass statue made of her. Notice the head of the Queen Mother leans forward in a style called a chicken's beak. The masterpiece, here it is. The Queen Mother bore the king's first son, but she had no other children and devoted her life to raising the future king, the future ruler of the kingdom. So the Queen Mothers were viewed as crucial to the health of the king and the kingdom. The Obas, or the kings, wore carved ivory pendant masks representing their queen mother during special ceremonies performed to rid the kingdom of negative spiritual forces. This gorgeous example of a pendant mask is believed to depict Idea herself. The two vertical bars that you see here, they're of inlaid iron. They're above the eyes. They are incisions or cuts that would be filled with medicine that were one source of her metaphysical power. You're now looking at one of the most famous masterpieces of African art. Notice the crown-like hairdo of the Queen Mother on this ivory pendant. And now take a look at the carved collar under her chin. This close-up shows you that these carvings are people, and they are Portuguese people. And the fact that they have been placed on this pendant illustrates the importance of the relationship with the first Europeans in sub-Saharan Africa and the Kingdom of Benin. About 1485, the Portuguese arrived in the Benin Kingdom. The Portuguese did not conquer Benin. Benin merchants traded with the Portuguese for pepper, leopard skins, cloth, ivory, and slaves. And with Portuguese contact, most of the so-called Benin bronzes were really cast from European brass acquired through trade. Brass became the ultimate sign of wealth and the exclusive property of the king. Oh, I love this. I just love this. So beautiful. This is a Portuguese trader. And notice the delicate quality here, even though he's carrying a sword. And sometimes figures of this trader were kept on royal altars or on the roof of the royal palace in Benin City. There are over 900 of this type of plaques in various museums around the world. This is a salt cellar, a container used for holding salt. It's made of ivory and shows Europeans with long hair, beards, and crooked noses. Here's a close-up of how beautifully this has been carved. Objects of this type were perhaps the first known examples of what we call tourist art from Africa. Trinkets, someone said, yes. The Benin king allowed decorated salt cellars, horns, spoons, and forks to be made for as souvenirs for foreigners. The city and the empire of Benin declined after the year 1700 due to the effects of the slave trade and tribal wars. In 1897, British and Benin forces clashed, and a British force burned Benin City, destroying much of the empire's art and looting what remained. But even though the British destroyed the city, they were stunned to find artistic works of such technological sophistication and beauty. The British assumed that West Africans could not have possibly made these objects, and they thought it was the Portuguese or the Egyptians. But archaeologists and historians have proven that it was Benin. Today, the art of the Benin Kingdom is among the most recognizable of African art. There are thousands of artifacts of the Benin culture featured in museums around the world. Today, 90% of African art lies outside Africa. It's in Western countries, housed in places like the Louvre in Paris, the British Museum in London, and the Metropolitan in New York. The fight for control of this art is one of the most hotly debated topics in today's art world. There are calls from African governments, artists, activists, and scholars and indigenous peoples to return the objects that were sold, taken, or traded during the slave trade and the colonial period. The policy of returning artworks to its rightful owners is not a new one. In the United States, there's a federal law that provides a process for museums to return certain Native American cultural items, such as human remains, sacred objects, and objects of cultural importance to the descendants and affiliated groups. And you all know the restitution of Jewish art stolen by the Nazis has been viewed as a moral obligation. But the issue of provenance of African art, it can be very complex, and it's also highly politicized. Most people agree that stolen art should be returned to its owners. But in the case of African art, some works have no clear provenance or have had several different owners. Some objects are orphaned. That means that there is no clear owner. And one of the biggest questions being debated right now is the role of Western museums that have African art. So here are a couple of questions. Do museums provide a valuable service in housing collections which expose large numbers of people to the full spectrum of the world's cultures? Or this question, are museums just outdated shrines to colonial history and treasures plundered from across the globe? It's tough. I'm going to do what I can to explain this. The debate of returning art to Africa gained worldwide attention in November 2018 when a report commissioned by French President Emmanuel Macron was published. The report concluded that French museums should return to Africa thousands of artifacts taken during the colonial period. The museum here in Paris that you're looking at, it houses over 70,000 African objects. And the French report, which really stunned French museums and stunned the world, identified that there are around 46,000 objects from this museum alone that would qualify for repatriation. In 2018, the French promised to return 26 artifacts that were looted from Benin. They had been seized by the French in 1892 as spoils of war. The artifacts include this royal throne and sculptures of the king of Dahomey, as well as a statue of a warrior god. Once these artifacts return to Benin, they will be housed in a new museum built with French support. They are among about 5,000 works requested by this African country. Last year, the French made good on their promise. They returned 26 Benin bronzes to Nigeria in December. Macron's decision to return African art put pressure on museums and other former colonial powers to follow suit. And perhaps nowhere has this pressure played out more prominently than in the case of the Benin bronzes. British soldiers, as I told you, seized thousands of metal casings, including the iconic Benin bronzes from the Kingdom of Benin in 1897. They were scattered to museums and private collections across Europe. These bronzes in Europe ignited widespread interest in African art. But in Africa, they've also become the symbol of the violence of colonialism. The British Museum prefers long-term loans to Africa rather than repatriation of looted artifacts. Several European museums have agreed to lend works to a new museum in Benin's city, Nigeria. But other governments, such as Ethiopia and Nigeria, have rejected the idea of loans, saying that they should not have to borrow back what is their own stolen property. But in a reversal of policy, the British Museum did agree to return 70 artifacts, including this lovely wooden or woven basket. There are several arguments against returning art to Africa, and I want to mention a few of them now. One viewpoint is that art belongs to all of us, and museums are such an important resource to display the world and its cultures. Also, by having objects housed in predominantly Western museum, it makes it possible for more people to have access to seeing them rather than in Africa. This is because the chances of a tourist visiting Europe or America are greater than going to Africa. And without these museums in Europe and the United States, perhaps only world cruisers like us would be able to see the wonders of the world. There's also fears about the safety of art if it's returned to Africa. Some African countries simply do not have the proper facilities to display art collections or the money to build them. Their museum structures tend to be small, and without sprinkler systems, climatically controlled rooms, and high-tech security measures, collections are in danger. And they're also in danger of being destroyed by fire, mold, or theft. In fact, one of the earliest demands for the repatriation of African art was made in 1973 by Zairian President of Mobutu, today's Congo. He pled his case at the United Nations for the return of stolen art as a way to educate his population about the history of his country. Belgium sent back 144 pieces. Almost all were stolen or sold back in Europe. And some believe that Mobutu himself may have sold the pieces to fund a presidential palace he wanted to build for himself in the jungle. A brand new national museum finally opened in this country a couple of years ago with funding from South Korea. It is up-to-date conservation and infrastructure. And if artifacts are returned, it has a capacity to display 12,000 exhibits. Islamic terrorism also poses a threat to the safety of African art. In 2013, a terrorist group linked to Al Qaeda set fire to the libraries in the ancient city of Timbuktu. They destroyed priceless manuscripts dating back to the 13th century. Today, Islamic terrorist groups are spread out in the Sahel region south of the Sahara, and this is an area as large as Europe. France has had about 4,000 troops in the region, but they're facing protests now this year by Africans who want them to leave. The case for repatriation is pretty straightforward. African art was stolen from them. It was done by European imperialists who overpowered them through military force. And even if force was not used, the methods used to gain the treasures were usually unscrupulous. They're deeply offended by the presumption that Africans are not capable of caring for their art. They see this attitude as barely contained racism. They also see irony. While the European colonial powers were filling their museum with African arts, they were promoting the inferiority of African art in Africa itself. Europeans say they want the art to be shared, to circulate, and to promote more understanding of African history and culture. Africans want that too. They're willing to loan African objects, but it should be the Africans loaning their art to Europe and not the other way around. Sub-Saharan African countries can no longer tolerate having 90% of their heritage in the hands of foreigners. This is where I was born. And I put this here because I'm so ambivalent about this issue. Some of my earliest education about the history of the area I grew up in was through hundreds of visits to Fort Stanwix Museum. I loved touching the interactive maps that showed the location of the battles and troop movements during the American Revolutionary War. I would touch and they would light up. And I know for a fact that my visits to this museum fueled my interest in history, and it spurred me on to go to museums wherever I traveled. I was able to see Guernica in the 1970s when it was still housed in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And I remember looking up at it. It was so big, and the images of the carnage that occurred there during the Spanish Civil War were haunting. But when the dictator Franco died, the piece was moved to Spain, which was what Picasso wanted and what was right. At the same time, I know that so much has been taken from Africa throughout its history, its identities, their people, their land, their resources. We live in a time where it's popular to get DNA testing. It can help people to know who they are and where they've come from. So with art, repatriation is a visceral thing, to return what belongs to them, to help them gain a sense of themselves. I wonder what they could do to inspire their people if they were only allowed to try. Tomorrow I'll be back to show you the essentials